Absolutely. Well, let me go to the next round. And in this next round, we're going to do a little bit of recapping what went on in that live event. And, I mentioned that I was one of the three speakers. And my specific topic was 5 specific strategies to make 2024 your best year yet. And let me give you those strategies, and then I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into one of them. So the 5 strategies, I'll number them 1 through 5. And they're not numbered in importance. They're just numbered to make sure I cover all of them. So number 1, reduce your insurance dependence. Reduce your insurance dependence. Definitely a strategy that will make 2024 your best year yet. Number 2, create your ideal new patient experience. Your ideal new patient experience. In other words, if you could design that ideally, what would that look like? Number 3, this is a tactical strategy. Master adding same-day dentistry in your practice. Master adding in same-day dentistry so that you make the most of every day. Number 4, fine-tune your marketing. This will parlay into what Aaron's going to talk about. Fine-tune your marketing to attract more what I call high-value services. So rather than just a new patient, consider refining your marketing to bring in more patients that are interested in the kind of things you're interested in growing in your practice. It may be adult orthodontics. It may be cosmetic dentistry. It may be complex restorative dentistry. It may be placing and restoring implants. And whatever it is, fine-tune your marketing to attract more of those kind of patients. And finally, a thriving practice is a practice that is system-driven rather than person-dependent. So we want to really revisit your systems in your practice to make sure your systems represent your practice in 2024. All right, let me take a deep dive into one of those topics. And I'm just going to choose one randomly in a minute. I'm going to call it the reducing insurance dependence. From this moment forward, if all you take away from this podcast episode is what I'm about to share with you, it'll be time well spent. From this moment forward, I want you to think about your insurance adjustments, the difference between your usual fee and your contracted fee. We call that insurance adjustment. I want you to think of that as a marketing expense, because that's what it is. You're paying Delta. I'm going to go ahead and name the culprit here. You're paying Delta hundreds of thousands of dollars to provide you patients. I'll use an example. And Curtis, I want you to think about this for just a minute. This is an example from my case study, my own client base. This is a client that didn't know what he was writing off because he entered his contracted fees into his practice management software. There's 2 ways to enter your fees in your fee guide. One way is to enter your usual and customary fees. The other way is to enter your contracted fees. All 3 major practice management software, Dentrix, EagleSoft, Open Dental, encourage you to enter your contracted fees because it makes it easier to track your collections because they're pretty much one-to-one. But 90% of dentists enter their contracted fees, and the downside to that is they don't know what they're writing off. So Naren and I wrote a custom Excel spreadsheet that was accurate is accurate to plus or minus 2%. And this was a new client of mine. And I'll leave the name nameless, but I'll share the data. In 2023, this office collected right at $1 million, just slightly over, but we're going to round it down to $1 million. We ran his data. He had 42% was his average adjustment in his PPO plans, and 85% of his patients were PPO patients. That was the data that we entered in to get to the finish line. And the question was, how much did he have to produce in order to collect $1 million? And the answer was 537,000. So he was producing 537, collecting $1 million. By the way, that is not a collections problem. This office collected 99.6% of their adjusted production. It was not a collections problem. It was an adjustment problem. This office, if you accept my definition of thinking that as a marketing expense, this office was spending, and I'm using spending in air quotes, $537,000 a year to the PPO plans to provide them patients. Curtis, you think there might be a better way?
Yes, but how much did he collect? He produced 1 million, or he
Produce a
collected
million 537 in
per.
real dollars of what his real fees were.
Okay,
Collected
cool.
1 million,
Yeah, there we
meaning
go.
that he wrote off 537,000. I want you to think of that as
That's crazy.
and the same dentist confessed to me. He said, Gary, I can't believe I was running around trying to save $1 on a box of gloves when I'm handing the fat cats at the insurance company $537,000 a year.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, that never shows up on the profit and loss statement as an expense because you don't actually write a check to Delta. It's even worse. They take it out before you ever get it. So
Mm-hmm.
hopefully I've motivated you to make 2024 the year you get serious about reducing your insurance dependence. By the way, I call it reducing insurance dependence because you do not have to go all the way to fee for service to radically improve your practice. Every time you successfully drop a plan, you improve your practice and
Mm-hmm.
improves significantly. But if you do want to go all the way to fee for service, I'm going to be your biggest cheerleader because that's the way to make the most out of that. But just so you know, you don't have to go all the way to make radical improvement of your practice. All right, this gives me a nice transition, Curtis, into your topic. Share some things that you know by looking at your. I'm going to call them your superstar clients, your dental and tel superstar clients. I don't know if you have an internal name for them, but the ones that you get to see their data and they're absolutely rocking it. What are some things, the patterns or things that you see?
Well, Gary, this whole concept of reducing insurance is very similar, because what's happening is you're looking at what's happening and then making a decision, right? Because even if that doctor's looking at his patients and he's like, hey, I'm okay spending or discounting $500,000 to get my million, because all those patients would not have been here at all, and I'd have to do something else to get new ones, and I'm comfortable with this. That decision to stay there is fine, although there is a better way. And that's exactly what I'd like to be discussing. I would like to share something though, really quick. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and share screen. And
So
well,
while Curtis is doing that, we'll put a video segment of what Curtis is sharing here. We'll put that on the show notes for this episode. So go to thrivingdentist.com, click the podcast tab. It'll take you to this episode, and you'll find a link to be able to see what he's actually showing. But Curtis will describe it if you're only listening to an audio.
absolutely. So Gary, this first thing that I'm showing here, what sticks out to you? This is a picture out of a magazine. Uh, what
Someone's
sticks out?
running with the bulls.
That's
Probably,
right.
probably
There's
in
some.
Spain. It's
They're in Spain. It looks like some of them are nutty enough to be wearing red clothing, and there's a couple nasty looking bulls surrounded by many, many, many people trying to get away.
Oh, that's you, is it?
Oh, wait a
What?
minute. Wait a minute.
Who is that?
There's a
Uh,
crazy guy among them. There he is. Yeah, wow.
so this last summer, I was able to go to Pompano and run with the bulls. Um, Now, many people would say it's a very crazy thing to do. But once I understood what was happening, it was very calming. Now, granted, it was still very high energy, high adrenaline, and all of that, but it was I felt a lot more comfortable knowing exactly what's going on. And here's what happened. The day before we ran, we hired somebody to tell us all what happened to all these other people. And he said, okay, this is where you want to stand. When you're standing here, I want you to look up top at this There's a line with a camera that goes back and forth down an alleyway. And he says, watch that camera. That camera 100% will move when the first bull's coming, because you will not see the bulls because there's so many people, right? They're lower than the people. They're not as tall
Yeah,
as, they're not 5 feet tall. They're about that, but they're not 5 to 6 feet tall.
yeah.
So watch that. And then once you're running, I want you to be going head on a swivel, back and forth, being aware of what's happening. And if you do fall, simply roll up in a ball, because the bulls do not want to step on you. If they step on you, they're going to hurt their feet. So if you open a ball, they won't step on you. Right?
So
All
you
of a
got some good
sudden,
primers. You got some really good primers there.
all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, okay. And he showed me like, do not go do this, do not go in this alleyway, because if you go there, you could get trapped. Never go up against a wall. You want to be in the middle. And as you can see here, I'm right there in the middle,
You're right in the
right?
middle.
Because I have options. I was able to get all this information because of all the data that was shared with me from somebody else who'd done this hundreds of times and also seen a lot of other people do it.
You got a running with the Bulls coach.
I did. So what I'd like to share with everybody today is a few interesting points. This first one I'm going to share with you is something called hygiene pre-appointment percentage. Hygiene pre-appointment percentage is different than reappointment. Reappointment is saying, hey, they left with an appointment. Pre-appointment is saying today they have one. So in a dental office, and in fact, this happened to me. I went to the dental office about 2 months ago. I left with an appointment, but a few days later, I called up and canceled my next hygiene appointment because I realized I was going to be on vacation. They didn't reschedule me on the phone. So as of today, I do not have a future hygiene appointment. That is pre-appointment percentage, saying of your hygiene patients, do they have something right now?
What percent has an appointment on the schedule right now?
Correct.
Yeah. And if you don't know this, if a doctor doesn't know this and you say, Doc, you don't know that, what do you think your answer would be on that? I bet most doctors, oh, it's going to be really high. It's going to be 80 or 90%, maybe even, 8 and 95%. And I would politely suggest that they're delusional.
But it's not unfounded, because I'm thinking as a dentist and as a practice owner, or even as a front desk person, most everyone leaves the office with an appointment. 80 to 90% of my patients leave with an appointment. So 80%, 80 to 90% have a future appointment. No, there's a thing called the law of decay. And that is simply, do I want to go? Yeah, I want to go down this road. In January, if you had 10 patients that had a hygiene appointment and you rescheduled 9 of them, then doing good, 90%. 6 months from now, one of them cancels. 6 months from that, like from that January, one canceled, one didn't reschedule, which means of the original 10, you have 8 showing up 6 months later. You fill up the holes with other people, but of the original 10, 8 show up. 6 months after July, which was their next appointment, you rescheduled 90% again. So of the 8, you now have 7, and one of them cancels, because that's average, 10% cancel. Of my original 10, just 1 year later, Gary, I had 10 in January. 1 year later, because of the law of decay, I have 6 of my original 10 coming in January.
And Chris, remember that the way we do our hygiene recare, it's a closed loop. In other words, if you're in that loop,
Keep going. Yeah.
that you're in, you keep making your next point. But if you fall out of it, you're now outside of that loop. And that's why it's not unusual for practices that haven't done any reactivation. It's not unusual for a patient to be 3 or 4 years, between their last hygiene appointment. And yet, if you saw that patient in the grocery store, and they would swear that you're still their dentist, but they haven't been in your office for 3 or 4 years.
Yep.
You both bring up an excellent point. I was talking to a good friend of mine who's a dentist, and she's doing really well. And I asked her how many patients do I have? She said 6,000. Then I asked her how many active patients you have. She said 1,400. So this loop that you're talking about is the culprit, right? Once they fall out, most practices don't have a way of getting them back into the loop.
Yeah. Well, and compound that by the last few years, where for a lot of reasons, it started with COVID, when everyone was thrown off their schedule because we couldn't make dental appointments. And there's still a lot of people out there that still think of themselves as you being their dental office, and they haven't been in since early 2019 or late 2019, early 2020. Curtis,
And
explain what we're seeing here for those of our listeners that are listening to this, because it's powerful information right here in terms of percentage.
This is a percentage. So of those patients Gary was just talking about, they're actually not included here because they've been removed for so long.
Right.
What I'm looking at here are my active hygiene patients, meaning they've been in the office the last 18 months. Do they have a future appointment or not? And what we're seeing is 5 years ago, we were about 45-ish%. 2019 and 2020, it went from 47% to 43%. So if I have 100 active hygiene patients, meaning I've done a cleaning with them, as of the end of that year, there were only 47 of the 100, and this is the average, right? This is the average of all 10,000-ish locations that we're pulling data on. 47 of the 100 had a future appointment. Something happened, though, from 2020 to 2021. Naren, what are you seeing? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, the data goes from 43% in 2020 to 53% in 2021. So it's a pretty massive increase, in a good way.
What happened in that time frame?
COVID. Yeah.
Okay. So all of a sudden, I am now being hyper focused on something very specific, or I'm not getting my hygiene patients to come back in and so it's been 18 months. So I'm either getting a lower amount of a lower denominator, or I'm getting more of my patients rescheduled. Which do you think that was?
I think it's a little bit of both.
It is a little bit of both, but what we're seeing with the data is essentially, like Gary mentioned, many of our active hygiene patients stopped coming in, and now we're only focusing on the patients that are more likely to show up, or more likely to reschedule. So it went from 53% to 57%, and last year 58%. It's been increasing because we're now focusing solely on the patients who are coming in who are more active to reschedule.
So, Curtis, for those of our listeners that aren't familiar with dental intel, we're talking about one very specific KPI here. How many KPIs? How many KPIs does dental intelligence measure in a practice?
I was actually just looking that up the other day. It's well over. It's somewhere between 100 and 200. I don't have the exact number. There's many more metrics out there, but KPIs, it's over 100. I don't know the exact number.
And in some cases, they're related to each other. One version of a KPI will go deeper into it than somewhere else. So, doctors, imagine that you have a dashboard, and you have a dashboard that allows you to see precisely how your practice is doing at any given moment. And imagine the difference in knowing what's happening versus not having the data and making assumptions. If you don't have the data, you may, if you didn't know, Curtis, what the secrets were to successfully running with the bulls, we might not be talking to you today.
Exactly.
But now you knew.
By the way, on this day, so I went back to the picture of me running with the bulls. This same day, right before, like behind us a little bit, up against the wall, these exact bulls gored 4 or 5 individuals up against the wall.
Wow. That makes, I get goosebumps thinking about that. That's, and that was happening right there. I guess that's why people do running with the bulls, but you want to avoid that.
But what I found from the coaches, don't go up against the walls and you're going to be okay. Right. So
you're right in the middle of the street. You're in good shape.
Yeah. So anyway, but exactly to that point, if you don't know where you are, and you haven't got information from others, it's very hard to move forward.
Even that reappointment percentage, Aaron, which I think if you ask most of our listeners to thrive, how do you do with reappointing your hygiene patients? Oh yeah, we do that. We do that. But does the data confirm that? Does the data back up what you think you're? Sometimes I'm going to be so bold as to say, doctors, sometimes what you think is happening in your practice isn't happening at all.
Yeah, even in that bull picture, right? Common sense says be as far away, so close to the walls, right? But the guy who has done it 100 times says, no, that's the worst thing you could do.
Yeah, because you would think, oh, I'm going to be safe up against a wall, and I can. No, that's not accurate.
Curtis, one of the really cool things when you get into the metrics within dental and tel, by the way, I'm a huge fan of dental and tel. I literally couldn't imagine having a practice without dental and tel. It's like driving an exotic sports car. Curtis, you know, I'm a car guy. It's driving an exotic sports car with blindfolds. I mean, that just makes my skin crawl. But one of the cool things you do is because you have this data set in over 10,000 practices, you have the ability to talk about your top 10%, your average client, and then the bottom 10%. Talk a little bit about that filter.
Yeah, so the hygiene reappointment percentage, meaning patients who leave without an appointment, if you were to say, hey, how well are you doing at that? Most people would say 90%.
Oh, we do that. We do that.
Or 90 to 100. Either if it's not 100, maybe one person's leaving without an appointment. So 90 in my 90% range.
Yeah.
Our top 10% range here, Naren, what do we got?
For pre-appointment, it's 75%.
No, reappointment. People leaving.
Yes.
People leaving with an appointment. I got highlighted.
Right. 93%.
90, that's the top 10%
Right.
is 93%. What's the average for last year?
For last year, it's 84%.
84%. That's the average. Here's what's nuts is that the bottom 10% last year is at 39%. That's leaving with an appointment.
Right.
Okay. The year before.
Darren, or Curtis, I'm pretty good at math. But last time I checked, 39% wasn't almost everybody. Am I correct? That doesn't meet the definition of almost everybody, does it?
Does not even come close. And this is, oh, by the way, we removed like our pediatric offices, who, you know, they are zero, well, excuse me, not pediatric. Pediatric does reschedule. We removed the bottom 10% of our data. We actually removed it all the way. And so we have, and the top 10% we moved all the way. So we're actually using the data between 10% and 90%. And then taking the 10, we're making it very accurate and not extreme.
You know, I'll amplify that. And as you're listening to this, imagine the difference in your practice. Imagine the difference it would make to have data that show you reappoint 93% of your patients versus reappointing 39% of your patients. Imagine the difference that would make in your practice.